Welcome back to our satsang this morning. As we mentioned yesterday, we're going to be having these 3 classes as a continuum, drawing themes from yesterday into today's class. So our topic today is achieving happiness and success through inner transformation. And I think there are 2 words that rob us of a feeling of happiness and success or accomplishment. And I'm going to share with you 2 stories, and I want you to try to guess what these 2 words are. They'll be woven into the stories. What are the 2 words that rob us of our success and happiness? The first story is one that Master loved to tell, and I imagine many of you have heard it before, but it's so delightful. The title of the story is A Man Named John. And in this story, there is a sincere devotee named John. And he prays to the Lord every day and has a deep devotion to God. But John he's very poor. He doesn't have enough to meet his daily needs. And as it comes to the end of his life, he prays to God, "Please, Lord, in my next life, I would be happy if only I had wealth." And the Lord hears John's prayer, and he said, "John, you are a devoted soul. I will answer your prayer." The next life, John is born with good wealth, quite ample material things. And he lives out his life, but he has very poor health. And so at the end of his life, he prays to God, "God, I would be happy if only I had good health." So in the next life, John has both wealth and health, and he lives his life, but he's lonely. And so as the end of that life comes near, John said, "Lord, I'm sorry to keep bothering you, but you have given me wealth and health, but I am lonely." And the Lord's getting a little exasperated by this time. "What more does this man want?" And he said, "All right, John, I'll grant your wish." So in the next life, John is born with wealth and health and a very devoted wife. But unfortunately, this wife dies at a young age. And so then you can imagine at the end of this life, John is praying, and the Lord said, "John, what is it this time?" And John said, "Well, you've given me wealth and health and a wife, but she died so young. I would like a wife that has a long lifespan." And the Lord said, "All right, John, but is that all?" Yes, Lord, that's all. And so the wife has all these things happen. Wealth, health, wife with a long lifespan. But unfortunately, the lifespan is a little too long. And she becomes old and kind of grumpy, and John isn't happy anymore. And he starts casting an eye at his beautiful young secretary, and he leaves the first wife and goes off with the secretary, who takes all his wealth. His health breaks down, and he's left at the end of that life with nothing. And then John starts praying, "Lord," and by this time, God is pretty done with answering this man's prayers. Nothing seems to make him happy. So he said, "Lord, I thought I would be happy if I had wealth. I thought I would be happy if I had health. I thought I would be happy with a wife. I thought I would be happy if I had a wife who lived long. None of these things have made me happy, God. Now I want only you." And the Lord blesses John and says, "Very good, you have learned the lesson." So that's the first story. Maybe you can guess the word that's woven into that story that robs us of our happiness. The second story is a true story that Master would tell of a man that he met who was a very successful millionaire. And Master said, "Oh, you have accomplished so much in your life." And the man said, "Well, I thought I would feel a success when." I made my first million. But now I think I will feel a success when I make my second million. True story. And Master said, unfortunately, the man had so much tension and nervousness and disharmony in his life, he never lived long enough to make that second million. And so there are two words here, aren't they? Can you guess what they are? If and when. These are the words that rob us of our happiness because we think, I will be happy if. I will be a success when. And we keep putting conditions on our happiness and success. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the world doesn't seem to comply with our likes and dislikes. It seems to say, this is what you're getting. What will you do with it? How will you respond to it? Don't put conditions on your happiness or put it out at a certain point in time that everything will fall into place. But as we were speaking yesterday, if we want to live, when we were speaking on the class, to live with Dharma and integrity, there are tools and attitudes that help us to do this. And so let's look now how the tools of living, inner tools, I don't mean hammers and so forth, inner tools for living to find inner happiness and success that are very reflective of the laws of Dharma. So the first one, we'll start with happiness, and we'll talk about several tools that we can use to find greater happiness within. And then we'll speak some of also success. So the first tool we can look at is to understand that we need the strength of character to live by the universal principles that we were speaking of yesterday. It's not enough to say, oh, these are all wonderful ideas, how well they spoke about them. But then you walk out, and the first moment the choice comes, someone butts in front of you in the food line and you react. The universe is perfectly timed every moment to test your resolve. And it takes unrelenting strength of character and focus to be able to live according to the principles which bring happiness. Master said it so beautifully. He said, the law of life is this: the less we live in harmony with the laws of truth within us, the more we suffer. But the more we live in harmony with that truth, the more we experience unending happiness. Unending happiness. This is the fruit of living in a way that reflects all the teachings that we have been given in every religion. It's not really based on religion. Someone once said, I believe it was a comment Sri Yukteswar made. Someone was saying, well, I don't really believe in God. And Sri Yukteswar, I believe, and someone will correct me no doubt later, said, if God's existence depended on our belief in him or not, he would be in a very difficult position. It doesn't matter if we say, oh, I don't think that really works. There are principles. And the more we trust in the infallible law that God has created, with which God has created this universe, the more we find ourselves in harmony with it. And when we are in harmony with those laws, we experience unending happiness. And so we begin, as we said yesterday, talking about Dharma and integrity, and that's the building block for happiness. Now, the second one, just as we talked yesterday about choices, is making the right choices to find happiness. Because happiness is a choice. As we said, the universe is always trying to pull the rug out from under us. Just when we think we have all the pieces of our happiness all stacked up like a house of cards, boom, something falls over. It reminds me, some years ago we were visiting Jyotish's family, and he has a nephew named Mikey, they called him. He was a little boy at the time, about 4 or 5. And we were all sitting around the table, and Mikey was building at the end of the table. He had little wooden building blocks, and he was building this tower. And we were all talking, all the grown-ups. But then that tower kept getting higher and higher, and finally everyone stopped talking, and they were looking at little Mikey because he'd built a very high tower, and he had 1 block left. And the tower was swaying back and forth, and he'd start to put that block on, and then he'd know, and then he'd start to put, and we were wondering what would happen. Finally, he started to put the block on, and he realized, and he said, "Ta-da!" And he never put the block up. And we called that the Mikey principle. Because if, for example, in Western history, if Napoleon had said, "Ta-da!" before he invaded Russia, the world would have been very different. And so this has been a big part of our lives too. And so, but to make the choices, because the world will not comply. I remember, some of you know the story, in 1976, Ananda was hit by a big forest fire, which is frequent in California, unfortunately, and the community was burnt to the ground. Everything we had, it was 8 years into the community, and everything was destroyed. Jyotish and my home, our home, everything was gone. And to make it a little more challenging, we have 1 child who's grown now, and this child was just 11 days old. So everything gone with an 11-day-old child. No insurance, no where we go from here. And Swamiji was so marvelous, because the first thing he said when he saw me, our first encounter when the fire was put out, he looked at me and he said, "How are you, Devi?" "Well, that's good." And he just walked away. He didn't give me a chance to complain. What he was saying is, choose happiness. Choose to find a way out of this, because if you don't, it'll take you a long time to regain your equanimity. And then a few weeks later, he wrote a little note when he saw that we had chosen happiness in spite of adverse circumstances. He wrote a little note, which I still have all these many 40-some years later. And he said, "I was sorry for the loss that you all had to sustain, but always remember, what God gives, we take." And so remember that in your own life. Don't feel, poor me, why did this happen to me? Why aren't they treating me better? What God gives, we take. And if we take it in a spirit of happiness and joy, then there's nothing there's no more test to be had. When God sees, there's nothing I can do to make them unhappy. I think I'll look somewhere else. And he casts his eye somewhere else for someone who still needs that lesson. So remember, choose happiness no matter what's going on, and you will begin to realize that happiness is the underlying reality of all circumstances. Truly it is. Swami said, joy is the solution, not the reward. You don't think, oh, if I do this, and if this happens and that happens, then I'll be happy. You choose it. It doesn't come by certain circumstances. So that's a second principle. And then the third principle for finding happiness, inner tools, and this is something we spoke of yesterday as well, is to be happy, you have to include others in your own happiness. If you only think, well, I've got my little world shored up, you'll find it's a very shallow kind of happiness. One of the very saintly people who is a member of Ananda Village is a doctor, Dr. Peter, we call him. And he was Swamiji's doctor. He is the doctor for all of the members of Ananda, but he also has a rural clinic, a clinic out in the country by Ananda, and he serves thousands of people, and many of them are quite poor. But Peter and he's been doing this for about 30 years now, and he turns no one away. But in America, I don't know if this is a big practice so much in India, but there's always, for medical professionals, there's always the threat of lawsuits, malpractice suits. If something goes wrong, oh, it's the doctor's fault, and I'll sue him and get millions of dollars, whatever. And so Peter runs his clinic very to the line of survival. He's doing it as service to God and Guru. And at a certain point, some people came in and said, oh, Peter, you must get medical insurance or practice insurance, because if someone sues you, you'll lose the whole clinic. And this insurance is quite costly. And Peter knew if he took out that insurance, he would have to raise his fees a great deal. And he didn't want to do that. He said, my happiness in running the clinic is serving others. And so he declined this insurance, knowing if anyone sued him, he could lose the clinic. But people knew that. They heard that. And Peter is so much surrounded. People came and they were volunteering. They didn't have money to give, but they said, we will do all the landscaping all around the clinic, and we will come in at night and clean the clinic for you. And whatever you need, we will do, because he included other people's happiness, other people's welfare, not just what's exigent for me, but what will help the greater good of everyone. And Peter is a very, very happy man. He's found peace in his heart and peace with God. And anyone who comes into that clinic feels this is more than just a medical practice. This is divine service. And I know there are many doctors here today that practice medicine in the same way, and we honor you for that. Now, what are some of these underlying principles for success? Because they again reflect living with Dharma in integrity. Ananda has two principles upon which it is based. Swami chose these. The first one is people are more important than things. And we could speak at length about that, but we won't this morning. And the other one is a saying Swami saw when he lived in India in the 1960s. He went to visit a Maharaj, I believe it was Kuch Behar. And the slogan, I guess you say, of this royal family, and it was emblazoned on their crest, was Chato Dharma Tato Jaya. Where there is adherence to Dharma, there is victory. And so never forget that. If you think you will succeed ultimately by adharmic actions, it really is not possible. Maybe in the short run you will, but in the long run. And why? Because Dharma is an underlying principle of the universe, and we draw power, and we draw strength and clarity and good judgment by making decisions in our outward life based on Dharma. And I will tell you a story. I shared it with a few of you recently, but of how this principle worked in an incident at Ananda. Ananda was created without really any money. It was just created with the goodwill of the devotees. And at a certain point, we wanted to create a school for the children. There were families living there. And one man, Nitai, had been a school teacher, and Swami asked him to start this school. And Nitai, this was in the 1970s, and Nitai had a salary, $50 a month, and that included school supplies for the students. So it was not a very padded budget. And he was trying to build a new school for the students because we started out just in a little chicken coop that was cleaned out. That was the first school. And so Nitai, little by little, over a few years, would gather the funds, and there would be work days, and they would build this building. And it's quite a nice building. Those of you who will be coming this summer for the 50th anniversary, it still stands, and it's a lovely building and a testimony to the power of dharmic action. And so Nitai had built this building with devotion to God and Guru. And then the building was done, and the building inspector came out, and he looked at the building, and he said, "This is fine, it passes all the codes." And then the fire inspector came out, many inspectors. And he said, "Well, the building is sufficient, but you need a way in case of an emergency to communicate with the outside world." And Nitai said, "Well, what do you suggest?" We didn't have cell phones in those days, and in fact, we didn't even have telephones at Ananda in those days. And the man said, "Well, you need to do a paved road out to the main highway." And Nitai was flabbergasted and naive, and he said, "Well, how much would that cost?" And the man said, "Oh, $100,000, something like that." And Nitai said, "Thank you very much." And the man left. And then Nitai that night went into his meditation room, and he just said, "Lord, I built this school for you. Divine Mother, if you want to close it down, if you want to take it away, it's yours." And that's all he did. And the man said he'd be back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks went by, and the fire inspector car pulled up. But a different man came out. And Nitai, again being a little naive, said, "Oh, where's the other man? And you're a new person." And the man said, "Oh, that other man got bored with this job. He went into arson inspection. It was more exciting. Who started fires?" And Nitai said, "Well, the other man said that I had to put a paved road out to the highway in case of emergencies." And the man said, "Well, technically that's true. But there's another option." And Nitai said, "Well, what do you suggest?" And the man said, "Do you have a whistle?" And Nitai said, "Excuse me?" He said, a whistle. You could blow it. And if there's a fire, you could blow your whistle and people would know. And Nitai said, "Sir, I don't have a whistle, but I'll go get one." And Nitai said he wore that whistle for many, many years as a symbol of when there is right action, there is victory. If we're living in that way, God supports us. And then finally, another principle there's two more. Another principle of success based on divine law is we need to be focused not only on the goal, but on the flow of energy. Because if we focus only on the goal, like the man that made $1 million, he wasn't satisfied because he got the goal, but it was empty. But if he had been focused on the joy of creation and helping employ other people and perhaps doing something of use to the world, it wouldn't have mattered how much money he made or didn't make. And Swamiji wrote, as most of you know, 150 books. And we were with him over the years as he wrote those books. And really, after every book he wrote, he always said, "I think this is going to be a bestseller." And the years went by, and none of them were bestsellers. And finally, someone said to Swamiji, humbly, not kind of challenging, but humbly asked, "Swamiji, do you really think that your books will be bestsellers? They haven't proved to be." And Swami said, "I can't afford to think otherwise, because this is what keeps the flow of my energy going." And no, none of his books became bestsellers, but They've been translated into nearly 40 different languages around the world. They've sold millions of copies throughout the world over time. They have changed the lives of countless people that we will never even know about. And I believe either today or tomorrow, Sangeeta, who runs our Ananda Publications, will be releasing Autobiography of a Yogi, Hindi Braille edition. And it will be distributed to schools for the blind and so forth. And not only is the text in Braille, but I say this because Ananda publishes. This is the first edition of Autobiography. And so Ananda Publications publishes this. But not only is the text in Braille, but Sangeeta was able to, on the cover, which is Master's face, to have a pixelated version so the blind people can feel what that face looks like. And on the back, it's Sri Yukteswar's face. So was Swami a success by these standards of bestsellers? Maybe not. But was he a success in starting a flow of energy by his enthusiasm and his desire to live in service to God and Guru that has changed more people the lives of more people than we can ever know? He was a glorious success in this way. And then finally, to really be a success in life, we have to work with the principles of harmony. Because if we're trying to create something at other people's expense, yelling at people, using our employees, being harsh with our family, we will never find success in that way. Once there was a woman who was a sincere devotee, but unfortunately she had the adverse karma that she created disharmony with others quite easily. And once she came to Swamiji and she was crying. She'd had a big situation with others. And she said, "Swami, aren't I in tune?" And he just simply said, "Attunement is harmony." And so look at, if you want to accomplish anything in life, let harmony be your underlying principle. Why? Just so people will like you and be happy? That's part of it. But more important, harmony is an underlying principle, law of existence. The universe is based on harmony. And the more we bring harmony into our service, into our lives, the more the universal laws of harmony support us and give us energy and bring us opportunities. I could speak at length of this in the history of Ananda, but it's written, at the end of the Christian Bible, the last book. One of my favorite lines is from St. John, and he said, "I suppose if all the stories of Christ were told, it would fill volume. All the volumes in the world could not contain them. And I suppose if all the stories of miracles and the blessings of dharmic living associated with Ananda could be written, it would fill many, many volumes. But we have learned through living these things, these are not empty words. These are true principles. And success and happiness are found by living according to the rules given to us in all great religions, given to us by our Guru. And the more we can demonstrate the power of living with integrity and truth through our own radiant happiness and success, the more we will help to change the world around us.
It's no fun having to follow a talk like that. So, today, as you know, we're talking about how these principles of inner transformation can help us achieve both happiness and success. And I want to refer back to the image I used yesterday, which is our consciousness being like a funnel. For those of you who had arrived last night or today, I'll just briefly describe that as the energy moves upward, and by that I mean consciousness, as our consciousness expands, as our thoughts are happy, as our willingness increases, as the energy moves upward, the funnel gets wider and wider. That means our consciousness expands. But as the energy comes down, that funnel gets smaller and smaller. And at the base, that tiny little funnel has hardly any room. And so people who are unhappy, who have mainly downward flowing energy, are stuck at the bottom of that funnel. And they're very unhappy, and they're very agitated, and they think, if only I could change everything, then I would be happy. But the key is to get the energy flowing upward. Now, in the yogic teachings, that energy flow actually is prana that flows in the subtle spine. And there are many, many teachings that are on our path, but not only on our path, that are basically the movement of energy in an upward direction. In fact, at one time, Swami had the thought that we should encapsulate all the teachings we have and call it the universal upward path, meaning that as the energy flows upward, everything begins to happen in a way that consciousness expands, that we become happier and we become more successful. So let's, for today, for my part, let's think of a very, very powerful upward flow of energy, and not like a little trickle of water that gradually fills up that funnel and a little bit at a time. A burst of light that flows upward and just fills up our consciousness. So if that happens, if we can get that upward flow going, what is the result of that in our lives? There are many, many things that are affected by that, but I want to concentrate this morning on 4 of them that are very critical to both our happiness and our success. The first is, as that energy flows upward, and the more powerfully that energy flows, the more energy we have, because that movement creates energy and health and well-being and positive attitudes of the mind. So as that energy flows, our energy increases and we start feeling healthy and vital and happy. And not only does the energy increase, but there's a law of nature. You know, if you take a wire and you run electricity through that wire creates a magnetic aura around it. That's the way an electromagnet works. The more powerfully you can flow energy through that, the more powerful the magnetism. So imagine now that we are able to very powerfully control an upward flow of energy in our consciousness and in our spine. What that does is it creates an aura of magnetism around us. And that magnetism creates miracles. Devi mentioned one, but I'll mention another. There was a time that we were building what we still use for the community as a small temple. At the time, it was built as a center for the publishing of Swami's books. So we called it the Publications Building. And Swami had kind of an inspiration in his meditation of what he wanted the building to look like. It sat on a hillside and that was quite visible, and he wanted it to have the appearance of a bird soaring. And so the roof of that building, the walls were typical like this. It was much smaller than this, but typical walls. But then the ceiling, he wanted it to slope upward and also to slope this way, so that it had a double slope to that roof. And the builders, he drew that out on a little, basically a postcard, and gave it to the builders and said, "Can you build this?" And they said, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." They had no idea how to build it. They knew how to build the foundation, the cement pad. They knew how to build the walls. They knew how to build the windows and the doors. But the roof, they absolutely were stumped. And so they got as far as they could go. And this is one of the great miracles of Ananda. They got as far as they could go. And they cleaned up the site. And they were ready to take lunch. And just at that time, a car pulled up. And a man got out and he said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And they explained that they were building a building. And he said, "Oh, that's interesting. I'm an engineer. And what will the building look like?" And then they got talking and they explained their dilemma. And the man said, "Well, it's very interesting. I may be one of 2 people in the state of California who knows how to build this roof for you." And he said, "I live about 500 miles away from Ananda. I'm not a part of Ananda. I had heard of it vaguely, but I woke up this morning very early with an absolute urge to go to Ananda. I got in my car and I drove 500 miles and arrived here today, and here's how you build the roof." And he explained it. So those of you who come to visit next summer for the 50th anniversary, you'll be able to see the living miracle of that. So what is the principle here? The principle is that the builders already had a flow of energy going. They already said, "Yes, we will do it, Swami." And they did everything they could in order to build as well as they could, as far as they knew. But that created an energy flow, created a magnetism, and that magnetism drew 500 miles away, one of 2 people in California. That magnetism drew him to drive 500 miles and solve the problem. And we have had many, that's a dramatic one, of course, many miracles like that in the building of Ananda. So the increase of energy creates magnetism, and those 2 together lead to success. Now, it isn't just left to chance. We have many techniques on our spiritual path to help accomplish this. One, we have the relationship Yogananda taught us, the relationship that allows energy to flow. For these lights, how do you turn the light on? You go to the wall switch and you flip that switch. How do you turn your lights on? Well, there's no switch, at least I don't have one on my body, maybe you do, but the switch is willingness. The switch is will. And if you're willing to do something, that energy will flow. The more willing you are, the more it will flow. And when you're very enthusiastic about accomplishing something, that energy will flow very powerfully, and the magnetism will flow with it. So will and energy, willingness and energy are linked together. So Master gave us techniques to help us get a handle on this. One is the energization exercises. He called those originally not the energization exercises. He called them the tissue will energizing exercises. meaning that with willpower, we can send energy to the very cells of our body. But it also teaches us how to send and withdraw energy. So sending and withdrawing energy, we can do and bring that flow of willpower and flow of energy under our control. Pranayama helps us increase our energy. If you need to accomplish something and you're a little tired, go out and walk vigorously. That's walking vigorously is a kind of pranayama, or better yet, do a few simple pranayama techniques, and it will energize your consciousness again. So there are many, many techniques on our path that have to do with the flow of energy and the creation of a powerful flow and the magnetic field that surrounds that. The next thing that happens is that when the energy flows strongly, we become bright mentally. So our energy flows, our magnetism increases when that universal upward flow and expansive consciousness. So it also creates a bright mind, creativity, openness, awareness. Everything mentally gets much broader and more powerful. Intelligence, everything in the mind is dependent also on energy. And so the flow of energy into the brain increases all of those kinds of faculties that we need. So if you were hiring an employee and you wanted an employee that was going to be a really good one, you want one with energy or without energy? Well, with. You want one with bright mind and creativity and intelligence, or somebody who's dull? Do you want somebody so I'm going to talk about intelligence. I'm also going to talk about the control over the reactive process and the opening of the heart center, the feeling center. So if you're hiring an employee, you want somebody with energy or without? With. You want somebody who's intelligent and bright or dull and lazy? You want somebody who's reactive and upset all the time, or somebody who's calm and centered? And finally, do you want somebody who's open-hearted and kind and communicative and caring and sharing? Or do you want somebody who's selfish? Okay, all the right answers. See, the energy, it's proof. The energy's already flowing, and the right answers have just popped right into your head. So you're all living proof of these principles. But all of it, again, depends on the universal upward flow of our energy. So how do we increase the energy to the brain? Well, pranayama also does that because it increases the energy. But there are other techniques that Master taught specifically to bring energy into the upper chakras and into the brain. Almost everybody in the room knows the technique of Hong Sa. Why do we practice Hong Sa the way that we do? It involves watching the breath, but it also involves watching the breath in the brain at the forefront in the prefrontal lobes of the brain. Because by concentrating here, we bring energy to the brain and to the mind, and that creates intelligence. It also creates a number of other effects for us. But for the talk this morning, just think of it as it's going to fill our mind and brain with energy, and everything will follow from that. Now, so if we can get the energy flowing strongly with willingness and a flow, we get magnetism. If we bring it to the upper part of the body, the mind becomes bright and focused. And if we can keep it contained and focused within, we learn to overcome the reactive process. We were talking with somebody at dinner last night, or a small group, and they were talking about the difficulty of living where people just don't seem to want to do what you want them to do. Well, that's the reactive process. Devi told the story about John. John always wanted something outside of himself, if and when. And so, if and when, if the answer to if and when is something outside of yourself, if somebody else acts the way that I want them to do, then I'll be happy. If I get a lot of money, I'll be happy. If it's outside of your consciousness, you end up with no control over that. But then, because you have no control, and you still want that, you end up getting frustrated. That's what it says in the Gita, that if desire is blocked, you become frustrated. Frustration grows to anger. Anger grows to the loss of the discriminative faculty, and the loss of the discriminative faculty results in the losing of your kingdom, in this case, the kingdom of your consciousness. And so that tendency to look outside of yourself and constantly want something and then be reactive in the world because the world doesn't provide that for you is the basis of all disharmony in the world. And it's the basis of all disharmony in your life, is that you want something that others or the world are not necessarily going to provide. Well, there are two possible solutions. One is to fix the world. How many of you think you can do that? Yeah. How many of you know that you can't do it, but still try? How many are mad at politicians because they aren't doing what you want them to do? Or mad at other people, or mad at employees, or upset with your family? Or you have exteriorized your desire for the reactive process, has externalized, and even though you know that you can't fix things, you still want to try. The great writer C.S. Lewis, he wrote the Narnia tales and all of that. He had a very good line. He said, many, many people want to serve God. Most of them in an advisory capacity. And so, if we want to serve the world as advisors about how it should behave, we're obviously going to end up frustrated and unhappy. So control over the reactive process is absolutely fundamental to our happiness. And once we begin to get control over that reactive process, then we don't get shaken by things. So the techniques that we have, especially Kriya Yoga, because we're there drawing the energy in and moving it under control of our consciousness, and then focusing deeply at the spiritual eye, which brings light to the brain. Any of our meditation techniques begin to control the reactive process. And when we can get that under our control, then happiness becomes a choice that we can make or not make. Nayaswami Jaya, one time, he's got a good sense of humor, and he's a very dharmic and righteous man. In India, sometimes when we have questions, people want to challenge a little bit and say, basically, what powers have you developed? Can you levitate? Can you, the other various other powers? And Jaya, when asked that question, said, I haven't developed any powers. I don't have any of those powers. Then he paused and he said, but I have developed one power. I have the power to choose whether I want to be happy or not. Because he had controlled the reactive process. I have the power to choose whether I want to be happy or not. Then he added amusingly, I don't always use that power. But getting that power is a really, really good first step. So the control of the reactive process. Again, we have many, many techniques, including yoga postures, including meditation techniques, including health techniques, all of those that begin to get control over that reactive process. And then finally, the last effect that all of this again depends upon the upward flow of energy. The last thing that happens is that the heart opens. Because the energy as it flows upward, if it flows downward, the heart begins to close. And when the heart begins to close, instead of loving everything, we begin to hate everything. Instead of caring about other people, we begin to see them as annoyances or as bothers or as something that we can use. The Dalai Lama had a nice statement. He said, the world was created in such a way that people should be loved and things should be used. But in our age, unfortunately, things are loved and people are used. So that is an indication of the downward flow of the energy in the heart. When the downward flow happens, we look at people as what can we get out of them? It doesn't matter if we cheat or we lie or we steal or all of those yamas and niyamas that we were talking about yesterday. Why bother to put out the effort to do those? When the energy is flowing downward, you only think about yourself and you don't think about others. Or maybe your energy just leaks out enough so that you think about your immediate family. Master Yogananda called that us for and no more consciousness. And so many, many techniques and many, many attitudes and teachings whose primary purpose is to bring the energy in an upward direction through the heart center, the Anahat chakra. And as that happens, the heart naturally begins to open and open and open until when that energy is positive and flowing strongly, you don't have to think about whether you should be kind. You can't really act in a way that is other than kind. You don't need to think about whether you care about somebody. You naturally care. If you have to think about it, you're probably not there yet. Because caring and the heart qualities are not something that's mental. It just happens. You just feel compassion, or you feel friendliness, or you feel connectedness to other people. All of it is dependent upon this upward flow of energy. And I would say that 95% of our techniques are simply, if you strip away the variations or the details, if you strip away the details, all of the techniques of yoga are to get that energy moving upward in a positive way, because when it does, the consciousness expands. So these are various ways that we can work on that upward universal path. But it would be remiss to end without saying the one most powerful thing of all that we can do is attune our consciousness to the Guru. Because the Guru has developed all of these elements because they're universal elements. They're elements of God. They're elements of the benign creation, the consciousness that created us all. And the Guru has developed them. So energy and magnetism, you look at Master, he didn't sleep or barely slept. He had a crew of people that he kept working day and night. They would work till 4 or 5 in the morning and doing dictation and writing his books and letters and so on. So he had enormous energy and, of course, enormous magnetism. He had the magnetism to change the consciousness of the world. So he had that. Think of the mind, the bright consciousness that he had. He had great, great wisdom and enough to change the consciousness of, first of all, America, secondly, the whole of the world. He had just wonderful control over his reactive process. He didn't react at all. One time, he was chastising a disciple, kind of yelling at her for something that she had done. And there was another disciple who thought, "Ooh, I've never seen Master mad angry. I've never seen him upset like this. Boy, she must have really done something to get his goat." And so he was shouting at her, striding back. And when he would go this way, he was shouting at her about how she had to change. And as he came back, he winked at the fellow who was sitting there. He wasn't angry at all. He wasn't upset at all. He was just trying. He knew that if he talked gently to this particular person, it wouldn't get through to her. So he had to put on that act. But he was always completely controlled. All masters are. And finally, the heart energy, he was a Prem avatar. And so as we get in tune with these, as we get that upward flow going, the consciousness expands into these universal, because that's what we're after, is union with God, union with the Creator. And the union with the Creator, our consciousness expands until we are one with the Creator. And in that state, we have all of the great qualities that God, the most benevolent and loving entity, has in and of himself.
Now we're going to take questions, and I don't see any on the altar, so you have some, okay. Oh, you'll call them out, okay. That's good. Well, I should add, remember we were talking about Dr. Peter, who didn't get practice insurance. He never has been sued, just to let you rest assured. Okay, who wants to read the first question?
So you can raise your hands and we'll come around.
And they will repeat your question after you ask it for the recordings, I think.
Is it really important to have your guru in physical form? And in case if you don't have, does it really make a difference?
Okay. You say it again for the recording. Oh, okay. So we'll just, in case you couldn't hear it in the back, is it really important to have your guru in a physical form? And in case you don't, does it make a difference? You want to start?
Okay. Yes and no. Then that's as much as I'll say. No. No. Master said at one point you have to have physical contact with the guru. But that physical contact can also be with the disciples of the guru. But you do have to, but you don't have to have physical contact. For instance, most of us consider ourselves disciples of Master. And if in this life we haven't had physical contact with Master, then are we just lost? No. We've had, Swami explained that the Master's power goes through the lineage of the disciples, but also at some point it could very well be that in our incarnational cycle we have had contact with the Guru. So in this life you don't, but ultimately at some point you do.
I'll also add, most of you know this, but Master said so beautifully when Swamiji asked him toward the end of his life, will you be as much with us when you're no longer in the body? And Master said, to those who think me near, I will be near. And so there have been many instances. We've heard from people sitting in this room who Master has appeared to them, helped them with their problems, guided their life. And similarly with Swami Kriyananda, I could tell a story, but it's rather long, but just miracles that have happened when people call on the Great Ones. So I think the most important thing is attunement. Attunement brings the Master near. And how do you get attunement? By devotion, by immersing yourself in the vibrations, reading autobiography, reading the books written by Master and Swamiji, calling on them constantly, inwardly, guide my life, offering your service to them. So attunement is much more important than physical contact with the Guru. Attunement is, because after all, they're not physical beings. They don't identify with the body. They identify with the overarching spirit. And that's where we can feel their touch and their presence always.
In my profession, it's more of a situation that making one set of people unhappy is the solution for making many others happy. And when I'm making those wrong people unhappy, that gives me a happiness as well. But eventually it creates a situation of confusion, that am I being too rude or too mean or what? So is it, and how can you make a person unhappy and then, because that is helping a lot of other people, and then make them again happy?
Well, that's okay. What about a situation where you make a small group of people unhappy, but there's a greater good because it helps lead to the happiness of others? I happen to know that this gentleman works with the prison system and criminals and so on. So let's take the question of, if there's somebody who's stealing and you catch him and put him in jail, you've made him unhappy. But you've made the people that he steals from happy. So what is the balance? Well, obviously the balance should be for the greater good. But there's a deeper way of looking at this. By catching him and putting him in jail and preventing him from stealing, ultimately you're going to help his happiness also. Because anybody who's acting adharmically is going to create, in the short run or in the long run, unhappiness for themselves. So preventing someone from doing negative things actually helps them be happy in the long run. And so we're going to talk tomorrow about the law of karma and how to work with your karma, how to overcome your karma. But here we're talking, in the answer of this question, about the karmic effect of negative behavior. And by helping stop that, ultimately you're going to lead even to the happiness of those who are temporarily unhappy by your actions. But you have to be sure that you're dharmic in what you do, because simply enforcing your will on somebody else is not necessarily the solution to their ultimate happiness.
Take the next question. That was as good an answer as I could come up with. This gentleman had.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My question is around Mikey principle. And
the Mikey principle he wants to know about.
Very important step of Mikey principle is tada.
Pardon?
Tada.
Oh, tada. Okay.
That's the mantra. The Mikey mantra is tada.
Well, thanks for sharing that story, and God bless Mikey with that wisdom. One of the key components, and it resonates in our life as we are running around and providing for our family. How do we know when is enough and when to call tada? Because I've seen that I would be running around and I don't know whether I have enough. Because the key principle which I learned from there was not only to call tada, but to build the blocks at that level when it became my key principle. If we would have left at 1 or 2 blocks, maybe we would not have noticed. So it's important to run around that I know to provide for family, but how to call it off and say that I can focus on something else.
Very good question. So essentially summing up, using the great wisdom of nephew Mikey and the Tada mantra, how do you know when you're providing for your family, when is enough instead of just going after more? I'll tell you a story from Master's life, which is very interesting. He had a disciple, Senor Cuaron. He lived in Mexico. He was head of the Mexico City Center there and was very devoted to Master. And at a certain point, and he had a family to support, at a certain point, he had lost his job, and he was desperately looking for another, going from place to place. And finally, he was contacted by this large corporation, and they offered him a very lucrative position. I believe it was vice president of a company. And he thought, oh, thank God, my prayers have been answered. But he just thought, as an afterthought, I'm going to send a telegram to my guru in Los Angeles at the time just to get his feedback. Master immediately telegrammed back, do not take that job. And Senor, very reluctantly, but with obedience to the guru, Senor Cuaron didn't take the position. And as it turned out, this was a corrupt, dishonest company, and they knew they were being investigated, and the person who took that job took the blame and was imprisoned. And Master saw if Senor Cuaron would have taken that job, he would have been the one that had suffered for that. But the interesting part then, and relevant to your question, is someone finally asked Swami, well, what did he do then? And he said, Master found him another job, much, much less than the vice president. And he only made enough money just to live comfortably, but not luxuriously. Master said because it's important, as Sri Teshwar said, live comfortably within your purse, because luxury and comfort are an elusive goal that ever stretch out to the horizon, that we never arrive at that point. So look at your life, look at what you're able to provide for your family, and say, do they have needs for health, for education, for comfort? Do we really need a second big car? Look, be realistic. Don't be driven by social mores. Oh, to prove I'm a success, I need this and this and this. The devotee should be reversing that flow and say, we have what we need. I am not going to erode my health, my mental peace of mind to be getting more and more. So you have to make a choice, and then the world will try to convince you otherwise. But the devotee says, the goal of my life is not material acquisitions, but peace of mind and attunement with my guru.
I'll add a little bit, but first a footnote that Senor Cuaron had, is it the grandnephew? Anyway, he has a nephew who won the Oscar as a director for the movie Gravity. Alfonso Cuaron. And so that's the nephew of Senor Cuaron and that has a very spiritual message in it, that movie. And so that sense of spirituality was part of the lineage of that family. Okay, back to the question, when is enough enough? Well, it's a hard question to answer because the more dependent you are for your happiness on something outside of yourself, the less enough will ever be enough. So if you're dependent on finances, when is enough? Well, you could have several, you could have 100 crore in the bank, and it wouldn't be enough, because who knows what could happen. Maybe there's a big crash. Maybe you lose your properties. And so it's never enough if your happiness depends on something outside of yourself. So for the devotee, as Devi said, we have to begin within reason to simplify our lives. Master didn't say that we should live in poverty. He said that we should live in simplicity. And so we need to, one, change our lives gradually so that we live a simple but adequate life, not in poverty, not in unneeded luxury. Unnecessary necessities is what Master called them, if we keep trying to get those. The second thing is that along with simplifying our lives, we need to bring our sense of fulfillment, our sense of self-worth, more within. Master said, praise does not make me greater, nor blame make me lesser. I am what I am in the eyes of God. If we can rest in that, most wealth is not needed. Whether you have a Maruti or a Mercedes is not about transportation. Is it a Maruti? Is that Maruti? Had the vowels mixed. Somebody could think it was a Maserati. Anyway, whether you have a Maruti or Mercedes is not about transportation. The Maruti will get you to your destination just as well as a Mercedes, maybe not quite as comfortably, but it's about the sense of status. And so having a big car, a luxurious car, gives you the sense that you're at a status that others can't afford. And so I'm not saying anything against Mercedes. I know people in this room who have Mercedes, and if you're not attached to it, then it's fine. But if the need, it's the internal need. If the need is to prove yourself, then enough is never enough. And so it's almost like there's a sliding scale, that the more you get self-contained and the more you have simplicity, then whether you have things or not is immaterial. And then enough is always enough. And so whatever you have is enough within the bounds of reason. Okay, maybe one more question if there is one. Two more.
Okay,
maybe
so
we'll
we
just
have
each answer
one question that was submitted. At times it becomes very difficult to forgive people who have harmed you. How to get resentment out of your heart and mind?
That's very important, and very important for our happiness. Master, in one of his talks, he talked about the use of memory. And he said, memory was given to us to remember only positive and beneficial experiences. To use it to dwell on past hurts and suffering is a misuse of the God-given power. So try to think about that. Think about, we were talking last night at dinner, I'm sure we've all had the experience where someone says something to you, and you think about it, and you think about it, and then maybe 3 days later you think, oh, I wish I would have said that. That would be a perfect response. And, maybe it's 3 days later, maybe it's 3 years later. But the more we hold on to those past things, because what are past hurts? Really, it's just a reflection of someone living in delusion, not in alignment with divine law. And so why dwell on delusion? It catches you so many ways, other ways anyway. Dwell on that which is positive. Dwell on, that person, maybe they said that to me one time, but think of that kindness they did at another time, and hold that memory. So forgiveness is really the most powerful tool, a very powerful tool we have to release negativity, release the hold that delusion has on us. Because as long as we take this world so seriously, we're trapped here. But if we said, oh, this happened and that happened, there's that beautiful story of the sadhu walking through the countryside, wandering sadhu, and he comes to a little village, and the boys start kind of teasing him, and then he doesn't respond, and then kind of taunting him, and he doesn't respond, and then one of the more aggressive fellows picks up a stone and starts throwing, and then they all start throwing stones at him, and one hits him in the head, and he's bleeding, but he just walks through the village, and then he comes back to his forest ashram, and his disciples said, Master, what happened to you? You're bleeding from many places. He said, oh, we had such a good time in the village today. The boys were laughing and throwing stones, and they had such a good time. There was no point of self-reference. Well, that's a very high state. But try to remember, what are all the hurts that we hold on to? It's reaffirming your own egoic individuality. If people have acted inappropriately, that's their problem. You let it go, and you remember that you are a child of God. So maybe one more question. Okay.
I'm going to make myself unpopular here. So what is it that drives the sense of being unable to forgive? What you can understand that someone has done something wrong, but if somebody does something wrong to a person on the street, it doesn't affect you very much. Maybe it does, but generally speaking, not very much. But if they do the same act to you, you're upset. So there's ego involvement. Moreover, what makes that being upset amplifies it? Almost always, it's because you're trying to overcome the quality of what somebody did to you. The seed of that is in yourself. And so you're projecting. You have actually drawn that experience to you. Karmically, you've drawn that experience. We'll talk about it tomorrow. But you've drawn that experience to you because your soul and God are trying to eradicate that from your consciousness and from your heart. And so the more upset you are with somebody else, the more you're projecting your own, almost always you're projecting your own dysfunction on them. And so if you're not willing to deal with a difficulty within yourself, then you're not going to be ready to forgive somebody for something that they did. And so the act of not forgiving is usually the fact that you're not willing to deal with that problem in your own self. And the solution to it is to forgive yourself and then overcome that problem. So, as I say, that is not a popular answer, but okay, last one.
I just want to ask one thing. In spirituality, we are very clear that when it is a conflict between head and heart, we need to follow heart. But what's happening in current world is getting more complex, data-driven, wherein human, decisions, thinking is changing. How do we handle the conundrum of handling things more with head than with heart in such situations? I would want your answers for that.
I'll repeat and see if I missed some important point.
Sure.
Essentially, in spirituality, we're taught to come more from the heart than the head. The world is so complex now. How do we do that and not just respond mentally? Well, there's a difference between mental response and discriminative response. Mental response is just the rational mind, yes and no, black and white. But the discriminative faculty, the intuitive faculty, is the blending of heart and mind. That's the wisdom of the consciousness plus the love of the heart. And that is the highest wisdom. And when we can approach life's problems intuitively, discriminatively, then we find the right answers.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Swami said specifically that real wisdom is the heart and the mind, discrimination, and the heart quality of love, basically. Love and caring, those two combined, that's what produces wisdom. And so we really need to balance those, but we're in an age that is too mental. And we need, both as individuals generally and as a culture, as a world culture, but India is very much this way. We need to have more of a, we've been too mental and too will-driven, and we need more openness and heart quality. That's why during this age, it's very, very important that we support women's rights, because there's more of a heart quality and a feeling nature, and the tendency to suppress that has gotten our society out of balance. And so we need to support that heart quality in the culture and in ourselves, and not just depend on rational behavior that is uncaring and unfeeling.
So you just redeemed yourself. You made yourself very popular now. By that
At least for half the audience.
Okay. You know, one final thing to add, because it's a very good question. Generally, how to know we're making the right decision. Ultimately, try to ask God. God has the highest wisdom, the highest love. Just anything you learn how to do, penmanship or art or swimming, anything, you need an advisor. What do I do? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? And so develop the habit of asking God for His guidance, His wisdom, His love in all circumstances.